Hello and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, which publishes chalkboardnews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. The inclusion of diversity, equity, and inclusion teachings in school curriculum across the country has been controversial for school boards, parents, and taxpayers alike. Now a school district in Colorado is doubling down on what is known as DEI policies. Aurora Public Schools says it will not implement any programs that do not prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. Joining me today to discuss this is Chalkboard's K-12 editor, Brendan Clary. Brendan, your team wrote about this DEI policy in Aurora schools. Tell us more.
Yeah, Dan. So this is, I think you put a good point on that. You know, this is something we've seen a lot of, right? There's been a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion in recent years. Some of that's been in the curriculum, and there's even been some state legislatures that have passed bills banning divisive concepts in the classroom, right? We've seen Florida, passing different sorts of legislation in their Department of Education, also expanding those rules to prohibit specific discussions about gender and race and stuff like that in classroom to try to, target some of these issues, right? And we've seen this being a big problem. And if you're not maybe paying careful attention to some of these school districts, like Aurora Public Schools, Chicago Public Schools, Boston Public Schools, they have these quite large equity departments, departments of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, I think there's a lot of companies out there who have these DEI departments. And I think criticism you could say with these school districts is, this is taxpayer money, right? These are public school districts. These are taxpayer funded things. So if you don't agree with that, it's a little bit different than, a corporation, which is private and can do whatever it wants, right? So, and some of these are paid, some of these DEI directors are paid, quite well for their positions. And so that's sometimes some of the top paying positions in some of these school districts are actually in the DEI department. But what you mentioned is exactly it. I mean, it's at the top of the document from the Superintendent Michael Giles there in Aurora Public Schools. He's got like a limitation from the Board of Education, basically limits what you can and can't do as a superintendent. And one of those things, as you mentioned, is you may not allow any implementation or adoption of any program that does not prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like that's sort of it in a nutshell. Like he's not allowed to do these other things. And a different way to phrase that is that they're all in on the diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of frames. At Boston Public Schools, I've written about them before. They have a similar focus. So like everything that we're doing is going to be focused on equity. So in Chicago Public Schools as well. I mean, I've covered some of their school board meetings. Everything that they're trying to do is focused on this equity work, and they'll have like an equity centered framework in terms of their decision making, in terms of their planning. So that is, not atypical, I guess, of a school district, depending on, where it is and what its leadership is trying to do. But in the broader scheme of things, if you're paying close attention to some of these school board meetings, this is something that is not outside of the ordinary, Dan.
So, Brendan, I know it was a long time ago, but back in my day, when I was a K-12 student, we focused on reading, writing, mathematics, science, history, core subjects like that. This new wave of diversity, equity, inclusion in schools, it seems like that could be distracting. And I think that might be one of the criticisms of it for people who don't buy into this. Is that a criticism that you've heard, or is that the main criticism of it? What are you hearing about?
That is a criticism that we've heard. And I believe it was a Center Square Voters Voice poll from last year. It basically asked people what they think schools should be doing. And they said, we want them to focus more on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. We want kids to be able to know like how to do these things, how to be a functioning member of society, and, have a successful life after they graduate, right? And be able to go to college or be able to get a job right after. And so I think that's where you do get some of this pushback of people who maybe they don't agree with some of the, specifically usually equity. You might have people who are opposed to the equity portion of the diversity, equity, inclusion because of critical race theory, right? They might say, okay, you're injecting sort of a worldview that is not there, maybe some hostility there. And yeah, I think that you can see where they're coming from with that, right? Of this is a taxpayer institution, and they're not teaching some of these things. And look at the test scores, right? And there are cases where there's been a lot of money spent on sort of these equity things or on social emotional learning, and so that does not have that trickle down effect into test scores, right? So anytime you're spending away from these sort of core programming things, and I've talked to somebody who studied restorative justice, right? And that's like a social emotional learning thing as well. But, if you're taking time away to talk about your feelings or talk about, how the school environment can be helped, then you're not able to focus on the math class that you're in. And so there's a lot of different things that go into that, creating the school climate and stuff. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of people who are sort of critical of these sorts of, ideas. And there was also part of that too, was that a push for social emotional learning and mental health supports. And I think that there's some criticism there too of, maybe expanding the role of schools to be more community focused or wraparound services. That's something that we've written about at Chalkboard as well, that there's sort of an idea now to have mental health supports and different social emotional learning sorts of programming at schools. And so that's, a different function than, back in the day, right? Of this is what a school is meant to be, where you come in and then you get your education and you take your tests and you graduate, right? And so there is sort of an expansion of that. And I think that, you do have people who are saying like, well, we need to figure out how to do the test scores. So I think that, if you're coming at this from an equity point of view, you're thinking, well, okay, I want to help everybody and those who are most in need. And this is a way to do that. Right. And so that's something. And then another interesting thing from that document is that they want to try to boost retention for staff of color. So essentially, Black and Hispanic teachers they're trying to hire them so that the workforce there, the teachers of the Aurora Public Schools more closely mirrors the student body. So that's another interesting push. And we've seen that elsewhere, this DEI of how do we hire and retain teachers of color.
Thank you for joining us today, Brendan, on this story about one school's implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. We know it's happening at school districts throughout the country. Readers can keep up with these stories and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Audible is a great way to gain access to an ever-growing selection of audiobooks. They've got what everyone's listening to: bestsellers, new releases, that story you've been waiting for. Follow the link in our show description to get 30 days of Audible free.